Chapter 27. Turf stumbled to a halt beneath the abandoned pier they had first gathered under only a few days before, as he sucked in great gulps of air. He had been running for what seemed like hours through the long grass of the plains as he's worked his way around the outer walls. The long grass forced him to lift his knees high with each stride, and he soon found his thighs were burning. The thought of being left behind, or worse still, others placing themselves in danger by lingering in the hopes of his return, kept him pushing through the pain. His palms slipped off the damp, slick support beam. Too exhausted to hold himself up, he sank to the ground, his hands and knees digging into the soft, wet sand. Closing his eyes, he squeezed his hands into fists, feeling the wet sand pass through his fingers. Cielo. He spoke her name in his mind as she appeared before him, her smiling face, the bright blue eyes, and her long brown hair swirling in the breeze. He felt his skin prickling as it cooled under the kiss of the wind coming up from the water's edge. Cielo. Her face contorts in anger as she lashes out at an unseen enemy with her sword, her face twisted into a snarl. Feeling so utterly helpless, he can feel the tears starting to form in the corners of his eyes. He knows now with a brilliant clarity that he has started to fall in love with someone he might never see again. Even as he knelt in the sand, she could be far from the city, fleeing in an unknown direction. How would he ever find her? A man could spend his life wandering, Quint, and never come upon the person they were looking for. Worse yet, she might be laying dead or dying, crying out in pain, while his arms should be wrapped around her in comfort. The first night in the camp, it was only the thought of her that had kept him going, the chance, however slim, that he would see her. All too soon she had been taken away again, as he had been forced out of the city on the march, and she had been led away by the cruel and pitiless Janiks. Had he hurt her? Had he done worse? Turf raged at how powerless he felt in that moment. The thought of not knowing where she was the cruelest of punishments the world could devise. He beat his fists into the sand, sprinkling grain geysers, rising with each hammering blow. Cielo! He screamed with a primal rage at the chaotic vista before him, heedless of who might hear. Fires still burnt brilliantly in the distance, illuminating the silhouettes of buildings. Figures scurried around the docks as supplies were rapidly loaded, sailors making ready to cast off. A panicked horde of townspeople could storm a ship in their haste to make good their escape and sink the vessel with their numbers alone. Turf rose to his feet and was about to take off running when a hand seized him by his bicep. Turf! The voice cried out in relief as he felt himself being whipped around and pressed into a bear hug. Palms were clapped to his back and his hair tousled. He struggled for a moment, realizing he was surrounded by his comrades from good old Pinehurst. A smile broke on his face as he wiped the tears from his eyes and returned their hugs with joy swelling his heart. Holding up his hands, he called for silence. Those boats are our only hope of getting out of here, and they look set to push off any minute. I don't know where Hitch and Cielo are, but they're sure to be around here somewhere. Let's get moving. We don't have any time to lose. Surrounded by his friends, the odds were suddenly a little more in his favor. The chances of finding Cielo and Hitch a little greater, and somehow they would make it out of here in one piece. Stop! Hitch hissed as he held up his arm to bar her path. Cocking his ear at the entrance of an alleyway onto the street, he paused to listen for the sound of thundering hooves. They had been making their way through the city towards the docks, weaving a path through the cramped laneways and alleys. Their broad bovine pursuer could not have hoped to follow them along. They had tripped and stumbled their way through the poorly lit and often pitch-black paths over broken boxes, glass bottles, and passed-out forms that muttered and cursed at the intrusion of their rest before returning to it. The air was still heavy with smoke and soot. The roaring inferno was consuming the city, rapidly spreading through the densely packed wooden housing of the outlying slums they were making their way through. Cielo broke the silence. There's something I don't understand about your plan, Cielo asked. What plan might that be? We've had several since we first got here." He did not meet her gaze as he kept scanning. "The Minotaur was tracking our scent." She paused for a moment. "Aye?" Hitch was unsure where she was going with this. "So we changed our scent to smell like pickles." Her voice rose at the end as she seemingly enjoyed saying the word. "True enough," he agreed, growing increasingly confused. "So why doesn't the Minotaur just sniff for pickles?" He could see her staring intently at him in his peripheral vision. "Oh, that's a great question," he retorted sarcastically before going on. "I'll be sure to be asking that while he's goring me to death. Oh, Mr. Minotaur, why didn't you follow the pickle path to my door?" Hitch had become quite animated in his sarcastic response and had to force himself to regain his composure. If he hadn't caught us in the act, we would have slipped away and he would have been none the wiser. Now, I don't know, but the blankets are still wet and will keep us safe somewhat from the flames if they get too close. His lecture finished, Shallow nodded, resisting the urge to cast the blanket off, and turned to point up the street at what appeared to be another alleyway they could use. Hitch nodded his agreement, and they were off running again across the street, feeling as exposed as a field mouse running for cover while an owl washes from its perch. "Rise." The woman's voice commanded gently. The Minotaur looked up and was astounded to see his mother standing before him. She looked as though she had not aged a day since he had last seen her so many years before. Oddly, she was dressed in flowing black robes instead of the simple dresses he had remembered. "Mother, how are you here?" Unable to take his eyes away from her, he failed to notice he was no longer in the shattered remains of the simple wooden home where he had fallen through the staircase. He wasn't anywhere at all. Grey slate tiles stretched out in all directions, perfectly aligned with an eye to rival any craftsman, until they disappeared into a distant fog. His mother stepped closer. "It's time to get up now. You have much to do, and have failed miserably so far." The rebuke stung so harshly because of who was delivering it. He had been called so many names in his short, brutal life, and knew the biting sting of whips as though they were old friends, yet the disappointment of his mother cut him deepest. I did the best I could, Mother." He started to plead before she cut him off with a swift motion of her hand. "Your best? This is the best you could do with the gifts I have given you? You do not think, but blindly charge like a bellowing beast?" He flinched at the word, a curse all too familiar as it was usually delivered to punctuate the biting sting of a whip. She stepped closer. Her features began to distort, twisting and morphing. "Where are your brains, beast? Where is your cunning? You have allowed yourself to be bested by a dwarf and a little human girl. They make good their escape, or you lay here." The form shifted beneath the robes, growing slender and lithe as the features of the face addressing him shrank and reformed, until the visage staring balefully at him was the same as the one he had seen on the roof of the temple. A slender hand shot out to slap him across the face with the force of a knight's mace. "Up, you dog, up!" Striking him either side of his face, she drove him to his knees. The pale feet before him started to expand into reptilian claws. The toes fusing into claws, the white milky skin turning to scales. He dared not lift his gaze as he felt something massive and terrible looming over him. He felt the multiple heads moving, smelled their hot, pungent breath as it burned the back of his neck. He braced for the sharp pain of fangs sinking into his skin, the rending of claws that could gouge through his body that would provide all the resistance of warm butter. The heads roared as one. He came back to the world with a start, scrambling and thrashing around into the debris as he came to his senses. Splintered timbers lay all around, a huge hole in the staircase above him where he had fallen through. There was nothing beneath the staircase. It was not an entrance to a basement or a walled-off section for storage. To his side was empty air, and the living room he had burst into while in hot pursuit of his prey. He crawled out and slowly rose to his feet, stretching and flexing. His muscles ached in protest, the wound across his thigh throbbing. He touched it gingerly and pulled his fingers back like he had touched hot coals as his nerve ending screamed. Looking around, he saw no clues that could help him, nothing to point in the ultimate direction of his quarry. Turning to leave, he was puzzled why he was picking up the overpowering stench of pickles.